Let me be very clear about one thing. I did not set out to create my dream game. What started out as a 3-day challenge quickly spiraled into a 5-month journey of unexpected self-discovery and the worst case of burnout I've ever had. This is the story of how rejecting my own advice cured my existential dread. The game started out like any other. I created a new Unity project and did all the things you normally do, with one important catch. See, the plan at this stage was to take my first Steam game, Air Obscure, and recreate a simple vertical slice for it in 3 days. Air Obscure was never really the game I wanted to make, and I thought, knowing what I know now, I could get a lot closer to my original vision of an immersive stealth game, a genre I still find fascinating and theoretically smaller in scope than an open world RPG. This time you would play as Robin Hood in a historically inspired fantasy version of Nottingham with 5 to 7 levels of stealth challenges. But I quickly realized that a game like that would still be big. Even though I wanted to create a vertical slice, I knew that to prevent the project from spinning out of control, I had to plan ahead from the get-go. I knew the game would eventually need controller support and key mapping, which for Air Obscure was nigh impossible to do once I had already implemented all the player logic. I ended up spending the entire 3 days just setting up and learning Rewired, a high-quality input system that will handle all that controller stuff for me, which would prove to be time well spent. With Rewired set up, I got to work on creating the stealth mechanics, which in the old Air Obscure demo was probably the most impressive system I've ever created. At this point, my motivation was at its peak. When it comes to programming, I love creating complicated systems from scratch, but systems like this can get out of hand very quickly. There's 3 main things I'm doing to keep the code under control. The first is when you have multiple components interacting, for example, the enemy is interacting with the player and the sound objects that the player is emitting. When you're making your first game, you're probably going to use getComponent for this, but a better way, in my opinion, to do this that I've learned recently, actually from a coworker who also makes games, it's actually better to use an event system because this keeps everything decoupled and every component does its own function. So for example, the player emits the sound and the enemy just reacts to that sound. It doesn't keep track of the actual sound itself, only to the event that the sound fires. The second thing is that a lot of the time when your code gets too big and you're trying to make a change, you're trying to remember where the actual thing that you need to change happens, and maybe it happens in a bunch of different spots. So it's very important to make sure that when you write your functions, each function only has one effect and no side effects, so it returns a value or it does one thing, and you're not confusing yourself by having multiple functions do multiple things or do the same thing in multiple functions. Although things seemed great at the time, I was constantly being reminded of what I hate about programming. At my day job, our codebase is enormous and a huge amount of our work is just investigation and trying to understand the systems that we're working on. This kind of investigative work is what I always feared when I was studying computer science that I'd have to do in my future jobs. And here we are. And so the seed was growing in my mind. I'm not good at my job. Other people seemed eager to dig into problems and write up documents and argue about the minutiae of different implementations. I struggled every week to find the motivation to try to match them, and I rarely went out of my way to find solutions to extra problems beyond the current task at hand, which is kind of expected of you in the software development industry. They want you to make the whole code base better and help out other teams and things like that. It's great, but it's not easy. With that festering in my mind, I tried to take solace in making my game in the evenings, but programming all day long was becoming exhausting. But time was running out. I wanted to finish the vertical slice by Christmas, so it was time to turn this prototype into a proper stealth game. So with the groundwork set, the important thing now will be to fully develop the enemy. It's very important to make an enemy feel good and fair to deal with in a stealth game, in any game really, but stealth game especially, because it's extremely easy for a player to get frustrated with a poorly implemented enemy. And so there are essentially 3 criteria that we have to meet if we want to make a good enemy so that the player doesn't get too frustrated. So first of all, detection has to make sense. The player has to know why they were seen or heard and exactly what they did to trigger that reaction from the enemy. It's the same thing that makes Dark Souls combat compelling. Number 2 is feedback, so audio and visual ways that the enemy will show what state of awareness he's in to the player, so that the player knows what to expect from the enemy at this current moment, and to help the player predict and plan how to get around the enemy, as well as to build a consistent pattern that the player will learn and understand that if I do this, the enemy will react like this. And number 3 is the level design. It turns out that level design is extremely important for stealth games, and basically the reason for this is if you play a game like Skyrim, for example, and you try to be a melee stealth character. Stealth archer is a different story, but for melee stealth characters, it's extremely frustrating because you're essentially going down linear hallway dungeons, right? They now introduce loops into the level design, and all of a sudden the player feels like they're outsmarting the enemies, and they feel good about that. They feel smart. Little did I know that at this point, everything was about to change. As soon as I started to bring my animations from Blender into Unity, an annoying bug ground my thus far crazy momentum to a halt. The animation looked great in Blender, but it was completely broken in Unity. After trying everything I could think of, I concluded that I had to be missing some weird quirk of importing animations that I just didn't know about. At this point, all I could do was spam forum posts to no avail. I was going from 8 hours of slog feeling like I wasn't good enough at work to immediately another 8 hours of a different kind of slog. And that agonizing feeling that I just wasn't the guy capable of figuring this out. If I'm not good at my day job and I'm not good at game dev, then what am I supposed to do? Why make videos if I can't make games and bring my vision to life? I was about to go home for Christmas. The devlog was supposed to be out by now. With 4 forum posts and 0 answers, all I could do was accept defeat and hope that maybe, after a 4-week-long break, I'd be reinvigorated to redo the animations from scratch. So it's the new year now. I went home for Christmas for about 4 weeks, and I haven't worked on the game for 5 weeks. I spent another week doing other projects. And to be honest, I don't feel like working on the game. I don't want to. I don't want to have to deal with the animations and redo all of them. But being home has reminded me how much I want to be home. And all this reminded me as to how important it is for me to get this game done. I don't know if it will replace a full-time job, and if I could actually make games full-time if I release this. But sitting around and not making it is certainly not going to get me any closer to finding out. So whether I want to or not, I just have to do this. I have to, because if not, I would just be wandering around aimlessly. And once I have the Steam page, I will truly know whether this project is actually worth it or not. Well, at this point I feel like I'm stalling, so I'm gonna get back to working on this game. But that didn't happen. Absolutely nothing budged on the game. I made a trickle of progress here and there, but ultimately it felt like nothing changed. It's been months and nothing was playable, and the fact that I would still have to polish everything, nail the game feel, and build out all these levels wall by wall, clutter mesh by clutter mesh, with everything I was thinking about, it was just way too daunting. I just didn't care about the stealth game anymore. I just didn't care about any of it. Hey, I'm back. So what happened? To put things into perspective, it is currently March 10th, and I started working on this video in November. It's been a while since that last clip. So what have I been doing? Well, for starters, I made this map. I went to go see the Northern Lights, and I went to the zoo a bunch of times. I learned a new tabletop RPG system, and I've been doing a lot of world building, and somehow I've even managed to regain some confidence at work, and believe it or not, somehow, against all odds, I've even made a lot of progress on the game, which has changed a lot. Let's talk about that. It's ironic that my last well-edited video was about burnout, because there's one very important aspect to burnout that I didn't mention in that video. What if you simply realize that the game you're making is not what you want to do? There's this idea in game dev that Thomas Brush talks about, and I talk about too, called finding your forte. This is basically the intersection between the thing you're really good at and the thing you love doing. This whole time I assumed my forte was programming. I do enjoy creating systems, but as the weeks stacked up and the burnout remained, I found myself asking, do I actually enjoy this? Why do I program? Why do I even want to make games? I don't program for the sake of it. Programming is a tool to achieve the creation of something that I think should exist, or that I have a firm conviction must exist and no one else is gonna make it. I once got some advice from Chris Sikowski, and I would urge all of you who want to make games to think about this too. What is the one thing you could do for the rest of your life, not get paid for it, and just slog away at work and then go home and spend your time doing this? What would it be? For me, I knew. Suddenly, I just knew it would be world building. Creating maps, histories, the interplay of factions. What characters live in this world? What convictions do they have? What should we learn from those who do not exist? And how can we depict them in an interactive, immersive setting? The decision was made. There was no going back. I knew exactly what my dream game was. It would have to be small in scope. Any notion of financial maximization had to go. I had to change my strategy. In case you haven't realized it yet, I'm turning my Robin Hood stealth game into an RPG. If you've seen my other videos, you know that I heavily advise against making your dream game, but at the same time, if you're not ultimately leading up to creating something you believe in, why do this at all? Why not just stick with a real job? Here's my plan for how I'm going to make this work. Once the Steam page is out, I'll focus on implementing or polishing one mechanic for every devlog, slowly moving towards a demo demo, and then a Kickstarter, and then eventually an early access launch. A little caveat about that early access thing, I started doing a bit of research into it while editing this video. There's still a lot of research that I have to do about it, so I'm not 100% sure about the early access. We'll see how that all goes. The plan is going to solidify a lot over the next few devlogs. So what have I done so far? Quite a lot, actually. I spent a lot of time researching, learning everything there is to know about Nottingham in the 12th century, architecture, combat styles, what armor they wore, and what fantasy elements would make sense to introduce into the set. I've also temporarily switched from custom animations to using Mixamo animations as placeholders, which allowed me to mess with the groundwork to implement combat. But that being said, I only had a few weeks until I came home again for Easter. I decided that the best course of action would be to refocus my attention on getting the Steam page done so that I could start gaining wishlists. That way I could quickly figure out if this was a game that people actually wanted before I got too deep into development, but obviously a Steam page needs screenshots, so the next priority was to figure out the art style, and if time permitted, create enough visually striking gameplay for a trailer. I generated some AI images for inspiration, and I really like this one, and then this one I can use for the color palette. I really like how contrasted it is between the light and the dark, and I also really like how the grass looks here, so I'm going to try to mimic something kind of like that. When it comes to creating screenshots, remember that the average Steam shopper is going to zip past them and click through your trailer because they're looking for gameplay footage. They'll see your cool lore, ignore it, and ask, okay, but what do you actually do? So when creating your screenshots, think in terms of verbs. Fight the enemies of King Richard. Sneak past the dark creatures that serve Prince John. Explore the countryside of Nottinghamshire. Customize your skills. Gain favor with factions. In our case, we also really want to emphasize the fantasy of being Robin Hood, so it'll also be important to show some archery. Notice that verb-based thinking also sounds a lot like a game's short description. Keep that in mind. Obviously, a lot of these will change once all the gameplay is in place and the mechanics are fully designed. I still have a lot of decisions that I'm sifting through, but overall, I'm really happy with how these screenshots are turning out. By the way, real quick, in case you're wondering why I'm making a historical game and not a fantasy game, even though I just talked about how much I like world building, surprisingly, doing all this research is very similar to world building. There's a lot of creative gaps that you have to fill in, and you're working off the same restraints, just these are historical constraints rather than world building constraints that you set yourself, and it still gives me the opportunity to tell the stories that I want to tell in this world, create factions and interplay between characters. And also, I just love the Middle Ages, especially the time of the Third Crusade, and the character of King Richard and Prince John. They're fascinating people, and I want to give people the chance to influence that world and be influenced by it, and to get some small snippet of what it might have been like. At this point, I'm just waiting for the capsule art to come in, and once it does, it'll finally be time to launch the Steam page, but I'm only going to do that once this video is out, which I guess for you guys is today. So without further ado, after a 3-year hiatus of not making games and some extensive self-discovery and a tremendous amount of support from you guys, I'm pleased to announce Robin Hood Shadow of Nottingham coming soon to early access on Steam. It would mean the world to me if you go and wishlist the game on Steam if you think that it's a game worth making and playing. Link is in the description, so please go and wishlist it. And if you want to make games yourself, once you've wishlisted the game, go and watch this video next to learn everything you need to know to start your game dev journey. And thank you so much for watching, and God bless.